who, like the poor, are always with us. Some had found the war an exciting thing, and better another than going back to Indianapolis. Present, too, unless one is gifted in evading the obvious, was economic interest. The war had provided jobs, started and expanded the factories, better military tension than back to the Great Depression.
No one, or anyhow not many, openly argued that the economic gains of the war should be preserved by the invention of a new menace. Economic interest always wears the disguise of national interest. It always has the solid respectability of practical business achievement. So it was then, and so it still is. One had an uneasy feeling that the respectable view would eventually triumph. And so it did. It had excellent help from the Soviets. In 1948, land and water communications with Berlin were interrupted. The barriers came down. Time has changed the view of this event. Few people think that the Soviets wanted to risk conflict, armed conflict in 1948. They were engaged in acts of harassment, not seeking the final showdown. If a convoy had presented itself firmly at the barrier, as many advocated at the time, it would probably have been let peacefully through. But we had airplanes. As often before and often since, policy was made by that fact. We have the planes, let's show what they can do. And it is not easy to criticize men who wished at whatever cost to minimize the risk of armed conflict. I do not do so. And so came the airlift. By the spring of 1949, 8,000 tons of freight was being landed each day in Berlin. This was enough for survival.
Berlin was not the only point of confrontation. A chain of events in those years was admirably designed to prove the inevitability of conflict, the march of world communism. The newsreels of the time recall the feeling. Czech takeover of 1948, the Chinese Revolution completed in 1949, and the Korean War, 1950.
Report from red-dominated Prague, February 21st, and the beginning of the 4 fatal days that ended freedom in Czechoslovakia. Leaving their factories, Czech Communist Party members marched to the town hall square. The situation is tense. 12 non-communist members of the National Cabinet have handed in their resignations, protesting the new consolidation of all police power into communist hands. In these films, just released through the new censorship of Czechoslovakia, Communist Premier Clement Gottwald denounces the ministers who have resigned as agents of foreign reaction.
Again, in retrospect, our view of these events has changed. Each had its separate logic and no grand strategy was involved. Earlier Soviet steps in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, had not been resisted, and some had been effectively sanctioned in wartime discussions, notably those of Churchill with Stalin. The Chinese we no longer see as Moscow puppets, instruments of a grand strategy masterminded from the Kremlin. The very idea sounds odd, but it didn't seem odd back then.
Another retreat for China's nationalist soldiers. Government troops pull out of the communist-threatened areas of Shanghai and Nanking, headed further south. Among those who have left Nanking is the Generalissimo himself, Chiang Kai-shek, whose fading fortunes parallel those of his falling regime.
That the North Koreans invaded South Korea despite some revisionist history, is not in doubt. That it was part of a grand strategy of Soviet expansion is now very much in doubt. It, too, was probably an act of local initiative. None of this was then seen. Together, this march of events was devastating, and those who did not accept the inevitability of Soviet expansion cannot easily blame those who did. Then in 1949, the first Soviet A-bomb was exploded well before schedule. Surely the work of spies, it was thought. To the other tension was now added the transcendent fear of nuclear destruction. And so the confrontation, in all its rigidity, it was a perilous moment in history. And there's a sobering thought here, how much of the knowledge on which we then based decision has been since revised or eroded. Those who questioned were now no longer defeated in argument, and some were suppressed. Search for the more articulate became an industry. The symbol of the search was Senator Joe McCarthy. McCarthy, however, was an aberration soon to be struck down by alcohol and his curious inability to distinguish friends from his enemies. He owed much of his place in history to the need that many felt to deny their own past hopes, a rather hard thing to do. The true voice of the times was John Foster Dulles. Law, religion, corporation lawyer, Wall Street, all the classical requisites for opposition to communism. Above all, it was John Foster Dulles who articulated the faith on which the conflict with the Soviets would be based. And it was richly in keeping with his own origins. Dulles grew up here in Watertown on Lake Ontario in northernmost New York State. His father was the Presbyterian minister in the town, and the countryside was only a step away. As a boy, he sailed on these waters with Alan Welch Dulles, his brother, partner-in-law, and in the Cold War battles to come. John Foster Dulles' case for the inevitable conflict avoided economics, no deeply suspect defense of capitalism, and no defense of democracy. We might have dictators on our side. His was a crusade for moral values, for right against wrong, good against bad, religion against no religion, the faith of the average, neighborly, God-fearing American. It was, let us note, a faith that required our policy to be either strictly moral or very cynical, and this was to be a problem in years to come. Dulles himself wandered from his small-town origins. He went to Princeton and was intended for the ministry. But soon he was persuaded that he could secure his faith almost as adequately as a lawyer. By the age of 38, he was the senior partner of Sullivan and Cromwell, perhaps the most prestigious of the great Wall Street law firms. Wall Street was not exactly small-town America, and people do not think of corporation lawyers as being primarily concerned with God's work. They're thought to have more remunerative clients. Dulles in 1929 was even a director of Shenandoah and Blue Ridge, the classic Goldman Sachs promotions that dissolved into very thin air when the stock market crashed. More wandering from his origins. Thomas E. Dewey, who launched Dulles in politics, said later that Dulles even took a temporary leave of absence from religion in these years, was an atheist, a very far cry from the boyhood days.
However, almost everything having to do with John Foster Dulles is a trifle ambiguous. Almost all historians, friendly or otherwise, refer to his brilliant mind. Harold Macmillan, on the other hand, who saw much of Dulles, was reminded of a statesman of whom it was said that his speech was slow, but it easily kept pace with his thought. Most people thought Dulles was paranoid where communism was concerned, but some said he got along well with the Russians. he was